19. Cass had barely made it halfway down the corridor to the hypervator when the alarm triggered. He'd just been getting used to the idea of taking a nap, too. But as soon as the alarm sounded from somewhere on Box's person, his adrenaline kicked into high gear again. "What the hell?" he asked as Box jogged past him, shutting off the alarm. "Medical emergency," he said. "I'm one of the shuttles." All humor was gone from his voice, and he broke into long strides to get the rest of the way down the corridor to the hypervator. "What happened?" Cass ran after him. "I don't know, but it's an emergency notification on Calypso. It's the shuttle Commander Diazol is on." Cass's heart dropped, and his jog turned into a sprint to keep up with Box. They reached the hypervator at the same time, and with Box's medical override, it was there in seconds. What could have happened out there? "Is there any other information?" "Is it the alien armada?" Cass asked. Box shook his head. "I don't know. I don't have much. Just an alert to report to Bay 1. Cass tapped the back of his hand, activating his communicator. "Saul? What's going on up there? Did they find the fleet?" "I'm sorry, Caspian," Saul replied. "I can't release that information to a civilian, but I can tell you the ship is not in immediate danger." Cass swore. "Okay, thanks." He cut the line. Damn rank privileges. He expected a snarky comment from Box, but the robot's attention was focused on the doors and the indicator beside them that told them what level they were on. "If it isn't the Armada, what else could it be?" he asked. "An accident?" Box remained still. "We'll find out shortly." The hypervator doors opened, and Box took off, Cass right behind him through the large corridor leading to Bay 1. They had to weave in and out of all the people moving back and forth, though most saw Box coming and automatically moved out of his way. Standing in front of Box when he ran was like standing in front of an oncoming shuttle. Only a few seconds behind Box, Cass entered the bay just as the Calypso was setting down. It had been pulled in by two of the Space Wings who had deftly maneuvered to get the small ship into the bay and down on the deck. Had something happened inside? Was that why she couldn't pilot anymore? He couldn't see through the darkened windows of the cockpit. Dr. Zax and Nurse Menkel stood off to the side, where Box joined them, while a crew of 4 maintenance workers approached the main hatch and began prying it open with an override device. The Space Wing sat down on the deck as well, Captains Wilmoth and Ryan hopping out of their ships to come help. Cass ran over too, but Box indicated he should stay back. He appreciated the gesture, but he wasn't about to stand by and do nothing. Ryan ran over as they pried the door open. Box was the first one to jump inside. "What happened?" Cass asked Ryan, watching the portal to the shuttle. Zax climbed in next. "I don't know. I just got the call from Wilmoth that she needed help. The commander wasn't making any sense. She was talking about this archway in space. Wolf called in the distress, said Diazol had taken over the ship and locked her out." "What the hell?" Cass asked. As he was talking, Wolf appeared at the opening and hopped down off the shuttle. The small ramp that usually came down hadn't extended when the ship landed. Cass saw Captain Green and Lieutenant Uma appear on the other side of the bay, and Wolf made her way over to them. "She just locked her out? And took over the ship?" Cass asked. "As far as I can tell. I wasn't there. I didn't arrive until Wilmoth was already trying to pull the ship away from the moon's gravitational pull. A few minutes in, and we finally got the ship under control." Box appeared at the opening again, holding what looked like an unconscious Evie in his arms. He hopped down and placed her on an anti-grav stretcher Menkel had beside him. Zax followed him out, while the captain and head of security went over to talk to Wolf. Cass turned to Ryan. "Is everyone else okay out there? Anything unusual?" "Nothing yet," he replied, "except for that. I'd go back out there now, but I have to make a report on this. Excuse me." Cass nodded, and Ryan left him to join the captain and the others. Just what in the hell could have happened out there to make Evie do that? Was it what had happened with her father? Could she be under that much stress? More guilt pulled at Cass. Maybe he should have reported his concerns to the captain. It might not have changed things, but at least they would have been better prepared for an eventuality like this. But then again, it would have been a violation of her privacy. Matcha had confided in him and asked him to look out for her, And look at what had happened. Cass watched as Zax, Mankel, and Box all accompanied the stretcher out of the bay. Box shot Cass one last look, blinking his eyes a few times. It was his way of expressing sympathy, something Cass didn't see very often from Box. How bad was this? He made his way over to where Ryant and the other pilot, Wilmoth, were talking to the captain and Lieutenant Uma. Cass leaned in close enough to listen. "Got a strange message from Commander Wolf, then it went dead again. Then the commander comes over the comm and says everything was okay." "That was when she shut down the comm," Wolf said. "I had to jury-rig my personal comm to get around the dampeners." She indicated her hand, which was bleeding from where she'd cut into her skin to make the connection. "Go on," Green indicated, his hands clasped behind him. "She seemed determined to land on this archway she swears she saw out there. I don't know what she thought she saw, but trust me, there was nothing out there." Green turned to the pilots. "Did either of you see anything?" Both shook their heads. "I had to physically pin her down to keep her from cutting the engines. But she is strong. I want that girl's workout routine. She got away from me, and finally I had to knock her out to get her to stop. I know I assaulted another officer, but given the circumstances," Green held up his hand, "we won't hold it against you, Commander. The computer was still locked out. I managed to get the engines to misfire, setting us adrift. By then they had hold of us, so it didn't seem to matter. Then the wings pulled us back in." "This is unbelievable," Green said. "Diazol has never shown this kind of reckless behavior." He turned to Cass, as if he'd known he was there the entire time. "I know the two of you are close. Did she ever say anything?" Cass, startled at being discovered, found 5 pairs of eyes watching him. He should tell them about her father, about the assault and the stress she's been under. But it wasn't his place. He couldn't violate her trust like that. "She never said anything to me," he replied. "She wasn't happy about me not going up with everyone else, but that was it." Green sighed. "I guess we'll have to wait for her to wake up before we get any further answers. Captains, please return to your ships and continue escorting the remaining shuttles. The mission proceeds." "Yes, sir," Ryant and Wilmoth said together, leaving the group. "If you think of anything else, let me know," Green said to Cass. He joined Uma and Wolf as they made their way out of the bay. As soon as they were gone, a sick feeling bubbled up in Cass. He stopped short of cursing himself right there on the middle of the deck. Instead, he left the busy area in frustration as the pilots got back in their ships and took off to resume the search. 20. Evie was in that place again. The place she couldn't remember before, but now it was brighter, stronger all around her. A shape approached her. At first it was just a formless mass, nothing more than a gray shadow. But as it grew closer, it coalesced around the edges, becoming more solid, until it had taken on the characteristics of the one person she didn't want to see. Evie backed up in this endless place, struggling to get away, as the body of her dead father approached her. His eyes had rotted from their sockets, and his skin looked waxy and dead. He approached her, keeping up no matter how fast she backed away, then grew until he was twice as large as she was, throwing her down on the featureless floor. He then held her down while she tried to scream, but nothing would come out. "You stupid girl," he said, the words coming out wet and heavy. "You aren't even supposed to be here. What am I supposed to do with you?" Evie struggled under his weight, panicking. She had to get him off. She had to get free. She struggled with all her strength, whipping back and forth until she finally felt him begin to lose his grip. Her small bit of progress only encouraged her, and she struggled harder. "Evelyn, stop!" It wasn't the voice of her father. It wasn't even the voice of a man. But it was familiar. And as much as she'd like to listen to the voice, she couldn't stop. Not until she was free, and this decaying bastard was off her. He grabbed her shoulders, and her eyes fluttered open. She was in sickbay, on one of the examination beds, and Dr. Zax was holding her legs, while Box stood above her, keeping her shoulders down. She immediately stopped struggling. What's going on? The images slipped from her mind faster than she could remember them, and she was more than happy to let them go. Whatever it had been was unpleasant, and she had no desire to try and commit it to long-term memory. Commander, are you all right? Zax released her legs. She nodded, and Box removed his metal hands from her shoulders. What happened? Evie asked. She tried lifting her arm to cover her eyes from the bright light, but found it was held down by a stasis field. There was an incident on the shuttle. Do you remember? Zax asked. The shuttle. It all came flooding back. The Arch, her confrontation with Wolf, losing control of the ship, and then Wolf knocking her out. But she seemed a lot less sure about the Arch now that she was back aboard Tempest. Had it really been there? Or was it some sort of illusion brought on by lack of sleep and too much stim use? Wolf had known. Had she told Zax? I'm not sure I remember, Evie said. I've been medicating on the side. Zax nodded. I know. Your blood is full of stimulant remnants. How long have you been taking them? About 6 days? Evie nodded. Ever since they left Sypaxia. You're not supposed to use them more than 15 hours at a time. They become less effective, and they can alter your brain chemistry. Do you remember anything about a giant arch while you were on the shuttle? Sure. The giant arch. Only the largest fabricated monument ever created, spanning the distance of 2 ancient moons. Probably the most magnificent thing I've ever seen. But it hadn't been real, had it? No one else had seen it, and now that she wasn't looking directly at it, what evidence did she have that it really existed? I don't remember, she said. I'm not surprised, Zax replied. Memory loss is common in cases of extreme fatigue and exhaustion, which is what you're suffering from. I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to remove you from duty until we can get you situated. You can't do that, she replied, trying to sit up. We have a mission. The future of the Coalition is at stake here. I can, and I will. Zax laid her hand on Evie's shoulder. She could feel the slight pressure through the stasis field. Do you want to tell me what you were dreaming about? It must have been something intense. You were fighting us the entire time. I can't remember that either, she said. This time it was the truth. It was as if once she'd woken up, whatever the dream had been had evaporated from her memory, just like the state of the dream itself. But she remembered how she'd felt. Terrified and small. And she had no desire to remember whatever it had been that had caused it. She was happy leaving it in her subconscious forever. If only she could get a good night's sleep. I want to keep you here overnight for observation. If necessary, we can erect a force barrier around the bed to block out all the noise. But I need to monitor your sleep patterns, see if we can't get your brain waves back to normal. Evie glanced up to the doctor. What's wrong with them? Nothing you need to worry about, Zax said in that practiced voice that told the patient to stop asking questions because they wouldn't like the answers. She turned to the data pad in her hand. Dr. Zax, tell me what's going on with my brain. Zax paused a moment, pursing her small lips. She sighed. I'm seeing some elevated readings that don't correspond to stim usage. They're nothing to worry about, but I want to find the cause so they don't develop into something more serious. It shouldn't take more than an hour or so. You can't do that from my room? Zax shook her head. It's better you stay here. We can monitor everything minute by minute. Box will be staying up to keep watch, and will notify me if anything is out of the ordinary. Evie smiled up at Box. His yellow eyes blinked in return. She thought that meant he was smiling back, but she couldn't be sure. Fine. Just get it over with. I can't afford to be off duty while we're looking for these things out there. The mission will proceed fine without you, Zax replied. There are plenty of qualified pilots, and the captain has assured me he won't let anything happen without you being notified. Evie hated it when medical personnel patronized her. She'd just gone overboard on some stims. It was nothing serious. It wasn't like she'd gotten into some Lobaz or Zip. Stims were harmless in comparison. "Can you at least release the field?" she asked. "Of course," Zach said. Box reached over and tapped a button on the side of the bed, and the field around her dropped. Evie reached up with both arms and stretched. She hated being bedridden. Across the room, the main doors to sickbay opened to reveal Laura on the other side, looking around the inside of sickbay until she caught a glimpse of Evie. Evie froze in mid-stretch. What was she doing here? She didn't want Laura seeing her like this, laid out and under observation. This was embarrassing enough already. Evie motioned for Zax to come closer. The Yax-Inax leaned in. "Can you ask her to leave, please? I'm not up for visitors, and Zax nodded. "Say no more. I understand. And I'm sure the lieutenant will, too." Zax stepped away from the bed and approached Laura, who had just stepped inside sickbay as the doors closed behind her. They spoke in hushed tones, and Laura's face transformed from anxious to horrified. She stole a glance at Evie, but couldn't hold her gaze, and Evie could tell from the way she was moving her hands she was profusely apologizing to Zax, whose own body language was emoting calm. Laura mouthed a quick, "Sorry," to Evie, before turning and leaving again. And it didn't escape her notice. Her face had been beet red. Damn it. That was exactly what she hadn't wanted. Laura didn't need to feel embarrassed she cared enough to come down here. It was just Evie was uncomfortable with anyone else seeing her vulnerable. And being in a sickbay bed was about as vulnerable as a person could get. "Damn it," she whispered, as Zax returned to her office. "I'm going to assume that isn't how you wanted that interaction to go," Box said. He still stood at the head of her bed. "No, not at all." "Wait a second. Are you and the lieutenant—" "No," Evie said, too forcefully. "I mean, there's nothing yet. There might be, though. I don't know." She closed her eyes. "It's been a really stressful day, Box. Can we talk about this another time?" "So that's why Caspian was so sure you weren't going to couple," Box said. "Now I get it," he said, his voice expressing pride. "Great. Now can you keep it down?" Evie said. "There are strict regulations about relationships between superior officers and those under their command, and I have to be careful." "Does that mean you're going to pursue it?" Box asked, his voice practically giddy. "No. I mean, I don't know. It's just, this isn't the best time. And we've got this alien thing to deal with, and—" "This makes so much sense," Box said. "Ever since Jatan, I've been so blind. I should have seen it 1,000,000 kilometers away." Evie knew how he felt. She wasn't great on picking up people's signals either. And though she'd noticed Laura's intentions back then, at the time she thought they were nothing more than playful. But it seemed there had been something more. Why did there have to be so much beneath the surface? Why couldn't it all be out in the open, like a giant flashing light on their chest that said, "Hey, I like you. Want to go out?" Not that it was something she could respond to easily anyway. It would be a lot less complicated if she wasn't first officer. Box placed a small device on her forehead. She tried to get a look at it, but couldn't see without a mirror. "What's that?" "Just a synaptic monitoring device. It will allow me to watch your sleep patterns," Box replied. "And I have to confess, this is my first time doing this procedure. Not that I don't know what I'm doing. I've seen 122 case studies of instances like this. And Zax won't be far away." "Are you supposed to tell patients it's your first time doing procedures?" she asked. His metal shoulder shrugged. "Zax is encouraging me to be more honest. She says Cass was a bad influence on me all those years, that I got too good at lying." His accent suddenly switched. "But from here on out, I solemnly swear to always tell the truth, no matter the cost." He bent down and winked at her with one optic. "Except maybe sometimes." Evie lay back in the bed. And Zax expected her to sleep in this environment? She'd be lucky if she even closed her eyes. But as Box made his way over to one of the control stations on the other side of sickbay, she could already feel the effect of not having the stims in her system. She stared up, taking note that she'd never really realized just how tall the ceiling in sickbay was. Above the soothing blue glow, she could see the inner workings of the ship, conduits, ducts, and wires, all assisting in the operation of the ship. But it was better than having a ceiling right there. This way, it felt more open, less confining. And it was with these pleasant thoughts that she finally drifted back into unconsciousness. 21. After the events in the bay, Cass had retreated to his room. His first thought had been to go see her, to see what sort of state she was in. But then he remembered their last conversation before she left on the shuttle, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Nor did he want to retreat to the bar again and sit under the judgmental stare of Marshall. Not that it worked any more anyway. The entire episode had triggered something in Cass, and going back to his quarters seemed like the best idea. He needed quiet, alone time to think and figure out what he was going to do. If anything, the incident with Evie had only solidified his resolve to leave. Not that he'd be able to anyway. She'd asked him for his help out there, searching, and he hadn't been able to do it. Getting back on a shuttle for a quick 20-minute trip down to a planet's surface was one thing, but being stuck in one out there, searching for hours, was another. And whatever Box had injected him with had either worn off or hadn't been effective in the first place. He was wound as tight as ever. So how was he supposed to leave on his own if he couldn't even bear the thought of being in a shuttle for a few hours? How was he supposed to live on one for a season or more before he found a suitable planet or system where he could barter for a ship? It was nothing but a pipe dream. He sat down at the small desk in his room, opening his personal terminal and beginning to search for other kinds of substances that could help with anxiety, when the chime at his door rang. Huffing, Cass got up. Why couldn't Box let him know when he was coming? Ever since the robot had moved into his own quarters, it was like he'd forgotten not everyone was available at all hours of the day. The door opened to reveal not Box, but Zenfor, staring down at Cass. Hello, Cass said, trying to block her view of his quarters with his body. There were half-clean clothes strewn everywhere. Did we have an appointment? No, Zenfor replied, stepping past him into his room. Come on in, Cass said, moving to the side, biting back his sarcasm. Is there something? I need to know what happened to the commander, Zenfor replied, and I'd rather not ask anyone else. Many of the crew still don't trust me. Why not ask Sester? Cass asked. Aren't you too close? He gathered up his strewn clothes and tossed them into the open closet beside the bed. Sester would have to report I asked, she replied, not seeming to notice his movements around her. And I don't want that attention yet. I figured you'd know, and if you didn't, you could find out. Cass stopped picking up clothes. Why? Did you find something in the scans? Maybe. But I still don't have enough evidence to make a hypothesis, she replied. So don't ask me what I found. Cass sighed. Do you ever act without evidence? On gut instinct? Some do, she replied, but they are few and far in between. For our systems and rules to work, there must be a certain order. Order that comes from empirical data. She took a seat without him offering, sitting on one of his favorite shirts. Cass gave up trying to clean. I don't know what happened. I haven't spoken with Evie, and what I do know doesn't make a lot of sense. Wolf said she started talking about things that weren't there. Some kind of archway? I don't know. I didn't get the whole story. But Wolf had to knock her out to get her to stop. They towed her ship back in. Zenfor watched him, her face impassive. Is that all? That's all I have so far, yes. If I still had my clearance codes, I'm sure I could read the full reports, but what are you looking for specifically? I'm having difficulty, she finally said, because I've never encountered anything like what I'm seeing from the scans. It shouldn't be possible, and yet the scans don't lie, which tells me it is something the Sill have never encountered before. What is? Cass leaned forward. Back at the nebula, when we encountered the creature, I was reasonably sure what it was right away, and I was right. A creature from an adjacent dimension. It made sense. These readings make no sense. I can't reconcile what I'm seeing with what I know to be true about this universe. What? Cass asked, exasperated. What are you seeing? A paradox, Zenfor replied, her face still impassive, but somehow also confused. If he didn't know better, he would almost say fearful, though there were no outward immediate signs. What kind of paradox? The scan shows something is there and not there at the same time. It shouldn't be possible, but I have verified the integrity of the scans. I don't know how to explain it. She stood again and looked out his window, her face away from him. It isn't often the Sill encounters something they've never seen before, and while exciting, it is also concerning. I'll need to let Melesse know, if she'll even talk to me anymore. Have you received any correspondence from her? He asked. No, and I am worried. She must know by now I've broken my oath. She turned to face him again. I need to know what the commanders saw, if it was real or not. Look, Cass said, Evie, she's under a lot of pressure at the moment. She's had some personal things come up, and I'm not sure. You think her mental capabilities are compromised? Zenfor's eyes narrowed. I think she's exhausted and overworked, and she won't give herself time to... He crossed the room to his sink and grabbed a glass of water, downing it in one gulp. You're distressed, Zenfor said, facing her body toward him. I'm fine, he said. She approached him, placing her hand on his shoulder. No. Your heart rate is elevated, as is your blood pressure. You are in a state of high anxiety. How can you tell all that? He asked. She released him. The same way I learned your language, by absorbing and interpreting the electrical signals your body produces. Is that something all Sill can do? With practice, yes. She turned her back to him again. If you don't know anything else, you can't help me further. I'll return to the weapons lab. If you find more information, let me know immediately. She reached the door and left without another word. Cass barely had time to process her swift exit before his comm chirped. He tapped it. Rabot? Boss? Can you come down to sickbay? She's asking for you. Cass's heart rate skyrocketed. If Zenfor thought it had been elevated before, she should see it now. What could Evie want with him? Especially after what had happened in the bay. Yeah, give me just a minute, he replied. He tried cleaning himself up in the mirror before giving up and heading to see what fresh obstacle awaited him. Box? Cass whispered as he entered sickbay. The main part of the room was dark, and Evie was over in one of the beds, her eyes wide open as she stared at the ceiling. They shifted a second as Cass walked in, then returned to their previous gaze. There was a small black device on her forehead, but otherwise she looked fine. Box approached him, leading him over to the far side of the sickbay, out of her field of view. What's going on? Cass asked. He glanced over to the window that showed Zax's office. Green was inside, speaking with the doctor, but because of the soundproofing, Cass couldn't hear a thing. She asked me to retrieve you. There's something wrong with her, and we're not sure what it is. She can't maintain any kind of REM sleep. Anytime she does, she goes into a fit. She nearly broke out of the containment field last time. I thought those were rated for magnitudes of force, Cass replied. They are. We can't tell where her strength is coming from, but when she's asleep, it's like she's channeling this raw power. Is it related to what happened to her on the shuttle? Cass glanced in Evie's direction, even though he couldn't see her from here. Again, we don't know. Zax has never seen anything like this before. Zenfor's words echoed in Cass's head. Could what she was experiencing be related to Zenfor's scans in some way? Or related to something of the system? Has she said anything? Cass asked. Just that she wanted to talk to you. She's refusing to speak with anyone else. Not the captain, not Zax, not even me. And I'm one of her good friends. Don't take it personally, Cass replied. Oh, by the way, I figured out why she won't couple with you, Box replied. It's so obvious I can't believe... Cass held up his hand. Stop. Now's not the time. Can I go talk to her now? Box nodded. Cass walked back around to the main beds. Hers was the only one occupied. Why do you think the ceilings in here are so high? Evie asked as he approached. She hadn't broken her gaze, and Cass followed it, so he was looking up at the ceiling too. I don't know. Maybe it's just more efficient not to have one, he said. I like to think it's because the designers knew sick bays are so boring, and patients spent a lot of time on their backs. They could have covered all that with a smooth surface, but no. Look at all those little pipes and things to look at. It's like a tiny maze. Evie, Cass dropped his eyes. What's going on? She winced, then turned to him. I wish I knew. She swallowed hard. You once entrusted me with a secret that could have been devastating for you if anyone found out. I need to ask for the favor in return. Her voice broke as she said it, as if she'd been holding something back, and it had come barreling through anyway. Cass placed his hand on hers. If there's one thing I'm good at, it's keeping secrets. She smirked. Good. Because once I tell you this, you're going to think I'm crazy. No more than usual, he replied. He had to admit feeling a sense of trepidation at her telling him. So far, he'd managed to let her down in every way conceivable. But this was his chance to stand up and help her. Maybe he wasn't useless yet after all. All he had to do was hold it together. 22. Evie took a deep breath. He was standing right there. So why was it so hard to start? She knew how it sounded. But after she'd woken up to find herself thrashing again, after yet another brief bout of sleep, it had been time to take this seriously. That, and she finally remembered what the dream had been about. If there was anyone on board who could at least appreciate the magnitude of it, it was Cass. Green would be sympathetic, but he wouldn't get it. Neither would Zax. They hadn't been there. They hadn't seen that crazed look in her father's eyes. And now, it seemed, even in death, he wouldn't leave her alone. She never should have gone down to that planet. I've been seeing things that other people can't see, she said. The archway? Cass asked, his words gentle. You know? He averted his eyes for a moment. I overheard Green and Wolf talking in the bay after they took you off the shuttle. They said you were determined to prove it was real. She gave a small nod. It is real. I had my doubts at first, when they brought me back in here. But it's out there, Cass. I don't know why I'm the only one who can see it, but it's there. I'm not making it up, and it isn't a symptom of sleep deprivation. She saw a subtle shift in his eyes, and knew that must be what he thought. But there's something else, too, she said. He didn't ask, only waited for her to gather the courage. My father. He's dead. He didn't react. But that's not the problem. The problem is, I keep having these dreams about him, and every time he's holding me down, screaming at me. And as crazy as this sounds, I think it's connected to the archway. And I think it's connected to the aliens. That did surprise him, as his eyes went wide. What do you mean? How could they be connected? I don't know, but I've been having periods where I've been losing time. Not long, a few seconds here or a minute there. And after, I can't remember what I have been thinking about. And even though the dreams have been happening since Hypaxia, the missing time didn't start until we got into the system. I asked the doctor. No one else is experiencing the same symptoms. And you're sure this isn't just your mind dealing with the trauma of what? It's not that, she hissed. She hadn't meant to get worked up, but she knew that's right where his mind would go. She didn't have trauma. The old man attacked her, and Cass knocked him off. He was out of his mind, and now he's dead. If only his ghost would leave her alone, she'd be okay. He put his hands out. Sorry. Just making sure. I don't want to overlook something that might be important. Evie sighed. I know, and it sounds crazy. Not to mention the crap I've been dealing with trying to find my mother. I thought you didn't have any information on her, Cass said. She scoffed. I didn't. Not until Dad decided some of his parting words to me would be to let me know she committed suicide because she couldn't deal with me, leaving him to raise me alone. Oh, he said, looking away from her. Hey, don't feel sorry for me. That was a crazy old man ranting. An old man who wanted to hurt me. I don't believe a word of it. But I can't find anything in her record, even though I have her name now. It's strange. It's just one more thing to add on the pile. Still, that had to sting, he said. Evie shrugged. It didn't feel great. But at the time I was more occupied with why I couldn't get him off me. All I can come up with is temporary paralysis due to fear. Which isn't surprising given our history. He always had that effect on me. I'm just glad the bastard is dead. I'm sure that's a relief, he said. Have you told anyone else? She shook her head. Why? It's not like anyone can do anything to help. Especially not while we're all the way out here. I need to get back on a regular schedule. But Zax won't let me leave. Which is why I need you. Cass scrunched up his face. For what? To go find the Arch. It's out there. But I need you to prove to everyone else it's real. It has to do with the alien armada. I know it does. It was there, spanning the 2 moons. She knew how it sounded. But if they could just find proof, if they could take some time to examine it, she was certain they'd find the answers they were looking for. But then she saw his face. It was subtle, but it had fallen a bit, as if he pitied her. And that was not why she wanted him here. If she wanted pity, she'd broadcast her situation to the entire crew. What she needed was someone who believed her, someone who was willing to help. But Cass wasn't that person. He'd humor her, and then report her back to Green while she wasn't looking. She cursed herself for not taking more time to build bonds with other members of the crew. This is what she got for keeping herself isolated. When she needed something, when she really needed someone to be there for her, she was alone. You know what? Never mind, she said. I think I'm just tired. She turned on her side with her back to him. I'm going to try and get some more sleep. Evie, just leave me alone, please. I need rest. Tears stung her eyes, but she'd be damned if she was going to turn back over so he could see them. She hadn't realized how much she'd been counting on him believing her, on helping her. But then again, he hadn't even gone out in the shuttle on the mission. Why would he be willing to head out now? She caught the sound of him shuffling away on the metal floor, his footsteps muffled as he retreated to the other side of the space. No doubt to tell Zax and even Green what she confessed to him. How could she have been so stupid? She should have just done it herself. Waited until Box and Zax weren't looking, then used her command codes to break through the system and access the bay. Then she'd be able to prove it. She couldn't hear anything else, and wasn't sure if he'd left already, or if he was still over in the other part of the sickbay, reporting his findings. This was so typical. Ever since she'd been little, it had always been her and her alone. No brothers, no sisters, and friends that were few and far between. Not many kids survived an encounter with her father when she brought them home. All it took was a snide comment about their appearance or abilities that often made them leave and led to her ostracization on Sisk. No one wanted to take the chance, despite there being so many diverse species on the planet. She'd been only one of 7 humans in her entire community, and that included her father. It only made things worse. Evie was never willing to let his attitude infect her, like it seemed to do to others. She'd watched as what remained of his family had drifted away because of his behavior, and she remembered them all giving her pitiable looks, as Cass had done. She'd been fighting against that look her entire life. The only one who never seemed to join in was her grandmother. Maybe that's why she'd given Evie the sword, not because she felt sorry for her, but because she saw something in Evie that told her she was worthy to have it. Her father had never even touched it, and had told her on more than one occasion he never cared to. And somewhere deep down, that made her feel better, knowing it had never been a part of him in any way. As soon as she got back to her room, she was going to hang it back up. Had Grandma known about Amanda Lawson? Surely she would have told Evie if she had. But more than likely, her father would have done everything in his power to make sure no one knew. Once that man settled on a position, it was impossible to get him off it. And if he decided no one would know a thing about Evie's mother, then that's just how it would be. She never should have gone there. He hadn't deserved her compassion. That was one mistake she wouldn't make again. Cass stood by the side of the partition separating one side of sick bay from the others, watching as Evie's shoulders rose and fell in small shudders, her back still to him. "Well?" Box asked. "What did she say?" Zax had come up beside him while Green lingered in the background. He wasn't sure what to do. Should he tell them she'd confirmed the art story, but that she'd also admitted she was under immense mental and psychological pressure from everything that had happened on Sypaxia? "Did she say anything that might indicate her mental state?" "I don't think she's been honest with us," Zax said, "and I'm afraid that lack of honesty might lead to some damage if we're not careful." Should he tell him what she said? About her father and her mother and everything else? If Osborn Diazol weren't already dead, he'd take a shuttle back to Sypaxia right now and beat the man into a pulp. What on earth could have been going through his mind? Had he really been so crazy as to accuse his own daughter of killing her mother? Evie really had won the terrible father contest. Osborn beat out his own dad by a couple light years. But the fact was, she believed the arch was real, when no one else had seen it. And she'd asked him to prove it, to prove she wasn't imagining it. But that meant getting back in a shuttle, flying out there on his own, and finding the evidence. The odds were it didn't exist. There was no archway, and it had been nothing more than the result of an exhausted and overworked mind. But then again, what if she wasn't seeing things? What if it really had been there, and she was the only one who could see it? She wanted to check on me. I've been having some issues lately, and I declined going on the mission. Hence the injection, Box said, nodding at Zax, who ignored him. "Yeah, so, I think she's just really tired. She said she had a nightmare?" "She's told us the same, but says she can't remember them. But it seems as soon as she falls into REM sleep, something disrupts her brainwave patterns, triggering the nightmare. I fear she hasn't had any deep sleep in almost a week," Zax said. She pulled up her pad and tapped a few tabs on the holo display. "If she can't get sleep naturally, we might have to sedate her." "Is that really necessary?" Green asked from behind her. "Captain, if humans don't achieve REM sleep, it affects them in serious ways. They begin hallucinating and become paranoid, erratic. We need to find whatever is interfering with the commander's sleep process before it becomes serious." "Is there anything else you need me for?" Cass asked. Zax's shoulders fell. "I suppose not. If she didn't tell you anything else, then there's not much we can do other than to try a few sleep therapies." She turned back to Green. "I'll get right on it. Box, continue to monitor her condition." Box nodded and returned to the main wing. Zax gave Cass one last lingering look before he removed himself from the conversation, passing back by the main part of the sickbay. He glanced at Evie, who still had her back to the door. She deserved better than this, and he was going to make sure she got it. 23. The corridor seemed to warp away from Cass as he stormed his way down them to the closest hypervator. He kept his head down, his eyes straight ahead. Nothing was going to stop him from doing this. All he had to do was remain focused. Once in the hypervator, he told it to take him to Bay 1. his heart pounding the entire way. Part of him said to go back and think about this, to not act so rashly, while another part told him if he didn't do this right now, it would never happen. He stepped off the hypervator and made his way to the bay, which was still a flurry of activity. Some shuttles were coming back in to recharge, while new ones with fresh crews headed out. He'd never seen so many flight controllers up in the windows that overlooked the bay, as they were coordinating everyone in and out at once. This was perfect. He'd never have a better chance. Cass weaved his way through the crowds of maintenance workers, pilots, and survey teams running back and forth, grabbing equipment, getting their shuttles ready. Evie's experience hadn't slowed anything down, which was good. Cass needed the distraction. One shuttle leaving the bay would be noticeable, but among this throng, he thought he had a good chance of making it. The one she'd taken out, the Calypso, was still parked on the side of the bay. No one had moved it from when the Space Wings had brought it in. It was the same shuttle Cass had taken out to meet the sill the very first time. He could do it again. He could pilot the stupid thing if he absolutely had to. He only hoped he didn't accidentally injure someone this time. But as he approached the door, he froze. The images of Susanna and Gripen caught in his mind. Susanna had jumped from her shuttle, and the creature had grabbed her anyway. She had been so close, and Gripen had watched. The image of pure terror on Susanna's face, and the look in Gripen's of desperation mixed with sadness, would forever be burned into his brain. How could he get back inside and go out there? With no planet to land on, and no marker other than the blackness of space, how could he do it? It wasn't possible. Someone shoved him from behind, knocking him from his thoughts, and it took him a second to come back to reality. He turned to see Saturina Yan standing there, a sour look on her face. She was dressed in her flight suit. She must have just come off escorting one of the shuttles. "Running off again?" she asked, watching him closely. "What? No. Why would he think that?" he replied. She hadn't said one word to him since Gripen had died, and he couldn't blame her. Like Raffinkel, she'd been close to Gripen. Why would she ever want to talk to him? Not to mention she was a woman of few words in the best of circumstances. "Because last time you looked like this, you ended up stealing a shuttle, and we had to come after you." Her helmet dangled from her right hand, bouncing against her thigh ever so slightly. "I'm not stealing it." She stared at him. "Okay, I am stealing it. But just to prove what Commander Diazol saw out there was real. And then I'm coming right back." "What's the trick this time? How are you going to keep them from grabbing you?" "Not running into you would have been a good start." He smiled, but she didn't return it. "I just figured with all the activity, no one would notice." "They'll notice," she said, pointing up to the flight controllers, "just like last time. Except then they didn't think you'd be stupid enough to take one. Now they're on the lookout for you." "So what am I supposed to do, huh? I already failed Gripen and Blum. I'm not going to fail the only person on the ship who actually believes in me." He turned back toward the shuttle, taking a deep breath and steeling himself. "That's commendable," Yan said. "But you're going to need something more than a faked core breach if you want to get out there this time." "Which?" She came around to the side of him and stared at the shuttle as well. "Gripen always thought was a badass move. I don't know if she told you that." Cass shook his head. He wished he'd had more time to get to know her, to get to know all of them. "What are you suggesting?" "You'll need help. An escort if you're going out properly. Riot will want in." He turned to her. "Why would you want to help me? Especially after what happened?" She pulled back. "What? You think that because it happened on your watch, it's your fault? Shit like that happens every day. You didn't tell the creature to kill them." "No, but I—" "What? Authorize the mission?" "Yeah, because the ship was in danger, and we were all going to get eaten if we didn't do something about it. It doesn't mean it was the wrong call. You did what you thought was right. All I care about is you do right by her, by them." She stared at the ship, then turned to look out into space, where shuttles were still coming and going. "Evie says this thing is out there," Cass said. "And I don't know if I believe her or not, But she believes it, which means that's good enough for me. And she believes it is a key to figuring out what happened to the aliens. So that's what I need to do. Well, you're going to need a pilot, because you can't fly worth shit, Jan said. Ryan can be in our flank. He turned to her. You're really willing to do this? To help me? Yes. This is the mission. We need to find out where they're hiding, and I have a feeling we need to do it sooner than later. If this arch has something to do with it, then let's find the thing. Do you know how to find it once we get there? Where do we look if it's supposed to be invisible? I don't know, Cass replied. But I know someone who can help. Get the shuttle ready. I'll be right back. Zenfort turned at the sound of the opening doors to see Caspian enter the weapons lab. No matter how many times she saw them, she thought she'd never get used to the human's smaller size. They were like miniature Syl, without the benefit of face blades. That, and their colors ran the spectrum. She couldn't help but wonder what a differently colored Syl might look like. I think I've got something, Cass said upon entering. She'd returned to her research, still trying to reconcile the two scans with each other. She'd already tried a spectral and radiation analysis. She'd even gone as far as performing an optical scan, thinking it was perhaps some simple illusion. But none had provided results so far. It was a maddening problem. If only there was an indication of a dimensional shift or an artificial wormhole. But no two three-dimensional images taken at exactly the same time revealed different results. Why could Starbase 5 still see them if they left the system? Have you made any progress? No, she replied, frustrated he'd even asked. If she'd made progress, she would have said something already. The fact that she was still engaged with her equipment should tell him everything he needed to know. What is your news? I spoke with Commander Diazol. She believes the archway she saw in space is real. I'm going out to look for it, to prove it exists. She thinks it's connected to the alien armada. Zenfort turned. Does she have any evidence for that statement? No, which is why I'm going to find some. I'm going to prove she's right. She watched him carefully. A sheen of human perspiration decorated his brow, and his breathing seemed labored. Also, he was virtually radiating anxiety, though it was more subdued than it had been in his quarters. If he had a biosuit, all of those issues could be solved for him in a matter of seconds. But it seemed humans and many other coalition species lived with their physiological problems, no matter the situation. She hadn't liked making the adjustment. You said you wanted to know what happened to her, right? He asked. She nodded. Then let's go. We're leaving now. She was curious, and it seemed the only way to discover the basis behind this mystery was to gather more information on site. I hope you don't plan on flying us yourself, she said. I've found someone who can help. She was keenly aware of how much getting back on a shuttle would affect him, possibly even more than he was. Caspian had a massive guilt complex, stronger than she'd seen in any other being. He would see getting back in the shuttle as possibly a betrayal to those he lost. The fact he was willing to do it told her he was resolute in his conviction to help Diazol, regardless of whether he believed her or not. Zenfort switched off her stations. Then let's not waste any more time. 24. Laura Yamashita stood outside the main doors to sickbay, pacing back and forth, trying to get her nerves under control. Should she be here? Probably not, but that didn't matter now. She'd come down here for a reason, and she was going to see it through. That was, if she could gather the courage. She glanced at the doors to sickbay again, and a wave of nervousness coursed through her, causing her to turn and pace down the other end of the corridor. Why was the thought of walking through that door so difficult? She'd tried this once, and already had been shut out. Laura was tired of sitting on the sidelines, waiting for something to happen. She could be waiting forever, and she just wasn't willing to do it. Damn it, damn it, damn it. She balled her hands into fists and extended them again as she paced back and forth. She needed to burn some of this excess energy off. Otherwise, she'd end up going in there shaking like a leaf, She'd done everything imaginable to get the commander's attention. Playful banter, a winning personality, suggestive words and looks, and either she wasn't getting it or she wasn't interested. But Laura couldn't tell one way or the other. The woman kept things so close to the chest, it was impossible to read her half the time. Which was part of what attracted Laura to her. There was something deeper there, something Laura saw in herself. A person cut off from most of the world, closed off without a lot of friends or family to support her. In all the time Laura had been on Tempest, she hadn't heard Evelyn mention anyone close, except for when she went to see her father. But it hadn't been hard to tell something had gone wrong down there. Laura didn't want to butt in where she wasn't invited, but she could tell it had gone all wrong. The one exception to her summarization of Evelyn's social circle would be Caspian. It seemed they had become close. But when he'd regained his commission, something had happened to their friendship, and Evelyn had come to Laura for advice. Well, not advice exactly, but she had confided in her. Kind of. Whatever it had been, it made Laura feel all warm and tingly inside, confirming her own suspicions about herself. It wasn't just a passing crush or fling. She was interested in the commander. And it seemed the commander wasn't interested in Caspian. Not in that way, at least, which had been a huge relief. Why does this have to be so hard? She muttered. She stopped in the middle of the wide corridor and hopped up and down on the balls of her feet, willing all the nervous energy to exit her body. Crewman Alakcha happened to pass by at that moment from behind her and gave Laura a very strange look. Laura stopped hopping immediately and returned a sheepish smile, then turned to the wall in embarrassment. Hopefully Alakcha would think it was just a strange human custom and not Laura being a loon. Okay, enough of this. It was time to either commit or go back to her quarters, because this was getting ridiculous. What was the worst that could happen? The commander could see her and have her sent away again. That hadn't been one of the most embarrassing moments of her life, no. She made it about halfway to level 4 before the tears had formed in her eyes. But she told herself the woman had just arrived in sickbay. She probably wasn't feeling great and didn't want any visitors. At least that's what Laura had hoped. And that had been the driving voice that had compelled her legs to bring her right back here, only after a suitable amount of time had passed, of course. Evelyn might be thrilled to see her now. Well, maybe not thrilled, but hopefully she wouldn't have her sent away. She would want to see someone, right? Who'd like to be alone at the hospital all day, especially after the gossip Laura had heard from Sophie and Abernathy? Something bad had happened out there, and it had involved their new bridge engineer. Laura took a few steps toward the door, then stopped again. Another scenario populated her brain. What if the commander told Laura not to bother her anymore? What if she said she never wanted to see her again, that Laura was bothering her too much? What if she'd already stepped over some invisible line she didn't know about? Trying again might be the final straw and sour the commander on her forever. What if she was better staying right where she was? But she'd been down that road before. Too many times Laura had let people she cared about slip through her fingers because she'd been too scared to take the risk of pursuing them. Wouldn't it be better if she knew one way or the other, rather than live in this sphere of ambiguity? It was easy to think yes. It was even easier to say yes. But when it came to actually walking in that room and facing the prospect of being rejected again, she found it was more difficult than she ever could have imagined. Laura turned and made her way back down the corridor, away from the sickbay, all of the nervous energy having dissipated from her body, as if some sponge had soaked it all up in one clean wipe. Maybe staying at her third-shift tactical station, where she got to see the commander, was better than the alternative. If she rejected Laura, she suspected there was a good chance she'd be taken off the bridge rotation entirely and moved somewhere less visible. Laura didn't know if that was true or not, but it felt like something that could happen. She made it 10 steps before she turned around and broke into long strides toward the sickbay doors, determined to get through them before she could talk herself out of it. If she just focused on not tripping over her feet and nothing else, she could make it. The consequences were going to be what they were. She was sick of waiting. The door slid open. But unlike last time, where she'd stood at the door as if waiting to be invited into someone's home, Laura pushed forward into sickbay, making a beeline for Evelyn's bed, where she lay, staring up at the ceiling. Her eyes caught sight of Laura and widened, and she began to sit up. It looked to Laura like she was trying to get up off the bed and away from her. "Excuse me," a metallic voice said. Laura froze and saw the machine, the robot, approaching her, his yellow eyes blinking in strange patterns. "Can I help you, Lieutenant?" Shit. She'd forgotten there were other people in here. She hadn't even considered someone other than the commander might stop her. Her heart rate jumped up again, and she opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Lieutenant, you can't be in here. The commander is trying to rest," Box said. "I know. Laura stammered. "Say something, you dolt." "I needed to see her." She took a breath. "I needed to make sure she was okay." "I can assure you she's under the best care imaginable. Mine." He held out one of his hands, indicating the doors. "Now, if you please." "Box, wait." Laura turned to see Evelyn had righted herself on the bed, though she was still sitting up. "She can stay." "But, Commander—" Box glanced from Laura to his patient, then back again. Something seemed to change in his posture, but Laura couldn't tell what. Oh my God, I need to monitor for my records. Human interpersonal relationships are my jam. Hang on a second." He turned to make a swift exit. "Box?" the commander said with authority. He stopped and looked at her. "What did we talk about?" He paused before answering. "You're not my experiment?" "I'm not your experiment. Right," she mimicked. "Could you give the lieutenant and me some privacy?" The robot's shoulders slumped. "Yes, I'll be over here if you need me." The commander leaned over as he walked away. "And no monitoring devices. This is a private conversation." A noise like a frustrated growl emanated from him as he entered the other part of the sick bay. She turned to Laura. "Just ignore him. He's overzealous about human relationships." I didn't realize," Laura began. "What? That I knew?" Evie's features dropped. "I knew. I just wasn't sure. I'm still not sure how to handle it. I mean, if you're not interested, I understand. But they didn't tell me anything when they brought you in, and I wanted to make sure there wasn't anything wrong." Laura stared at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "No, it isn't that," Evelyn said hurriedly. "It isn't that I'm not interested. But these things are complex. Because you're my junior officer, and it doesn't help we're in the middle of a crisis." Laura's heart was practically beating out of her chest. She was sure Evelyn could hear it in the quiet of the room. She wasn't sure what to say. "So, are you okay then? Why are they keeping you in here?" She lay back on the bed, which had raised to accommodate her upright position, so she was still mostly sitting up. "They're not sure. I'm having a hard time sleeping. But I don't think it's anything serious. I'm not dying." A smile broke across Laura's lips. "That's good." She scooted closer to the bed, so she was right next to it. "I'm really glad to hear that." The silence between her words was deafening. She took a breath. "I wanted you to know, if you need someone to talk, or if you need to get something off your chest, I'm here. Thank you." She wrapped her fingers around Laura's, her warm hand causing Laura's breath to hitch. She might pass out. She might just pass out right here in sick bay. "I know I haven't exactly been receptive. It's fine. I mean, you're the first officer. You have a lot on your plate." Laura was having trouble concentrating. All she could think about was their hands now intertwined as she stared at them. She didn't know what to do. She hadn't actually believed she'd ever get to this point. For the first time since they'd been on that crappy old ship together, leaving Jatan, and Laura had watched Evelyn expertly pilot them out of almost certain death, she felt like maybe this could actually go somewhere. That all her pining hadn't been for nothing. "Still," the the commander said. "It wasn't fair." She squeezed Laura's hand, then let go, drawing back. And while she was disappointed, Laura let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. All she could think of was how warm she'd felt. It had been a feeling that had traveled up her arm and into her core, radiating out from her. "Would you like to pull up a chair?" "Oh." Laura looked around, her excitability getting to her. If she wasn't careful, all that nervous energy would come bouncing right back. "Sure." She walked over to the far side of sickbay and rolled a portable chair over, catching sight of the robot leaning from around the corner. As soon as he saw her, he pulled back and out of sight. She smirked. She was just as astounded as he was. Once she returned to the bedside, she took a seat, happy to be there, and really happy not to have suffered another rejection. "Thanks, Commander." Evie smiled in response. "I think you can call me Evie. As long as we're off duty, it's okay." She drew a deep breath. "So, tell me what's been going on since I've been in here." 25. Cass stood at the opening to the shuttle, taking deep breaths and trying not to think about anything other than the mission. Jan was already inside working on the startup procedures and fixing whatever Evie had broken in an attempt to keep the ship out there. He knew he should be inside helping, but he was having trouble moving his feet. The opening to the inside looked too much like the blackness that had consumed Susanna and Griffin. It was like staring right into the creature's maw. Cass felt a hand on his shoulder, and slowly, as if someone was turning down a burner, his anxiety melted away. He glanced up to see Zenfor, not looking at him, but with her eyes closed and face up to the ceiling. She released him, and he felt like he could breathe again. "Thank you," he said. "All these emotions," Zenfor replied, opening her eyes. "They are tearing you apart." She shook her head, then blinked a few times, as if she'd come out of a trance. "You can feel them?" "I can feel their energy. You have a lot of self-loathing." Cass scoffed. "Don't remind me." At least now he felt like he could get inside the ship. "Can you do that whenever you want? The shoulder thing?" "Only when it is impeding our mission. Get aboard," she ordered. He smirked and passed through the door. And even though he still felt some anxiety about re-entering a shuttle, it was as if the effect had been muted. The sensation wasn't as sharp, and he found it much easier to ignore. Did the Sil have the capability to share all their emotions like this? It must make for some interesting relationships. "How are you feeling?" Jan asked, not turning from the console. Cass noticed a sizable crack in its face. "Better. The console helped me. What can I do to help?" "Check the fuel reserves and make sure whatever strain the ship was under didn't weaken any key systems. I'm still running a diagnostic." "I'll set up over here," Zenfor said, moving past him to the side of the shuttle, where an empty station sat. Zenfor ignored the chair and bent over, programming in her link from the weapons lab to bring up all her research data. "My plan is, once we get out there and close to whatever the commander saw, I'll be able to detect it using some unorthodox methods." "That's the hope," Cass said, bending down and opening the access panels in the floor, which regulated all the engine functions. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes to make sure everything was in good working order, at least good enough for this trip. They shouldn't have to go through anything too harrowing. Then again, that's what he'd thought when they went out to try and communicate with the creature. Everything was supposed to go to plan, and both shuttles were supposed to come back. He couldn't move his hands. He couldn't even set the deck plating down. "Breathe, Caspian. Remember to breathe," Zenfor said. He nodded and took a breath, then a longer one. Then he closed his eyes and drew one in through his nose and exhaled through his mouth. He set the deck plating down and began to inspect the engineering components. "Bryant, you good?" Jan said over the comm. "Hey, I'm always good. Just waiting for you to get your lazy butts out here. I don't have all day." "Keep yourself in check, hotshot," Jan replied, "or I'll start doing circles around you in this thing." Laughter came from the other side of the comm. Everything looks good down here, Cass said. We shouldn't have any problems. He replaced all the deck plating and stood, moving to the front of the shuttle. His hand shook slightly, but he grabbed the head of the chair and remembered to breathe. Then I think we're good, Jan said. Are you ready to see if we can get past flight control? Cass shook his head. No, we're going to do this the right way. He tapped the ship's comm. Captain, this is Rabot. Rabot? What's going on? Green answered. I'm taking a shuttle out with the Consul and Captain Jan. We're going to investigate Evie's claims. I think something is out there, sir. Rabot, we don't have time for you to waste chasing phantoms. If you want to join the search, fine, but we need you in Quadrant C16. It hasn't been searched yet. Sorry, sir, but I think she's onto something, and it may hold a clue to what we're looking for out here. I'm not asking permission. I'm giving you a courtesy call. Cass nodded to Jan, who fired the engines as the door to the shuttle closed, sealing them in. Cass gathered up all his stress in his shoulders and tried to relax them, but it only halfway worked. Are you going to make me send the wing squadron after you again? Green asked. There was some seriousness there, but there was also humor in his voice. I've already got 2 of them on my side, but I'll be sure to let you know what we find. Green laughed. This is akin to mutiny. Good thing you're not a soldier anymore. Good thing, Cass repeated. Good luck out there. Let's hope you find what you're looking for. Green out. Cass nodded. If there was one thing he'd learned about Green, it was that the man was fair, and he always took everyone into consideration. It was what made him such a good captain. He indicated to Jan, who maneuvered them down the busy deck and out into open space, where Ryan sat off to the side of the bay, his wing at standstill. About time, he called through the comm. How much heat can we expect? None, Jan replied. Rabot took care of it. She shot him a smirk. I'm inputting the shuttle's previous course now. It should take us right where we want to go. Do you think there's a chance we could speed it up? Cass still gripped the edge of the chair. Might help if you sat down first, she replied. He did as she asked, though he didn't feel much better. I think we can shave a few minutes off. Cass didn't like the grin on her face. Hey, Ryant, catch this. The shuttle shot forward, its engine strained to maximum, as Jan followed the original course Evie had set. But she did it with a style and flair Cass hadn't seen before, her hands gracefully moving over the controls, as if they were an extension of her own body. You're such a cheat, Ryan said. Cass caught the edge of the space wing through the side window. He wasn't having a lot of trouble keeping up. You only say that when I do it, Jan replied. Her focus zeroed in on their destination. Cass glanced back at Zenfor, who remained hunched over her terminal. Clearly, none of this affected her. He stood again and approached her terminal, while Jan and Ryan began flinging insults at each other. Do you think you'll be able to find it? Cass asked. I do. It's a matter of calibrating my sensors correctly. If no one else saw it, then it means something must be obscuring it intentionally. So then you believe her? Zenfor turned to him. Of course. Why wouldn't I? He shrugged. Just with everything she's been dealing with, and all the pressure, I thought maybe... You know what? You're right. It never should have been a question. A fresh wave of guilt passed through him. If Zenfor could find it within herself to take Evie at face value, why couldn't he? Because she'd had a traumatic event down on Sypaxia? That didn't matter. When else had she ever let her personal life get in the way of her professionalism? She was the most professional person he knew, and she didn't exaggerate. In fact, she often downplayed the significance of things until there was more evidence to go on. His eyes widened. In a way, she was more like Zenfor than anyone else on the crew. No wonder the Sil had taken her at her word, despite the lack of evidence. Evie had shown a pattern of behavior Zenfor found familiar. It all made sense now. What? Zenfor said. You have a funny look on your face. Nothing, Cass smirked. It's just sometimes you can think people are so different from one another, and it turns out they're almost exactly alike. Her eyes lingered on him a moment before turning back to her console. We're almost there, Jan said. I'm bringing us in slow. I don't want to move past the point where the shuttle last stopped, in case there is something out there. The last thing we need to do is crash into it." Cass returned to the front. Out in space hung 2 moons, both orbiting a larger planet, though all 3 looked like nothing other than barren rocks. Probably Class C or D if he had to guess. Either way, neither would support any life. Not in the way they knew it. Beyond that, there was nothing remarkable about them. There was no archway anywhere he could see. "The moons have moved slightly since the shuttle was last here," Jan said, "but we're in the same relative position. They're both tidally locked." Cass turned to Zenfor. "It's your show. See anything yet?" "As soon as I do, you'll know," she replied. She was grumpy, and probably for good reason. She'd confessed it wasn't often Syl were stumped, and this situation was probably something she never thought she'd have to deal with. "You guys good in there?" Ryan said over the comm. "Fine. We'll hold here," Jan said, "until there's a reason to move." Cass stared out the window, watching the moons for any sign of something irregular. But there was nothing, as far as he could see. Evie had been so sure, and yet... He tapped a few of his own controls, bringing up sensor filters. All of them were blank, telling them there was nothing out there. He sighed. There was a thump behind him. "Mashkalal," Zenfor said, frustrated. "If I were aboard a Syl ship, we would have long discovered the nature of this mystery. How am I supposed to work with this primitive equipment?" "I thought you'd modified it," Cass said. "Modifications only go so far," she replied. "I can't turn a river into a mountain. I can only turn it into a bigger, faster river." "It has to be here," Cass said. "Did she describe it?" Jan asked. "She said it spanned the 2 moons, whatever that means," Cass said. "It must be massive," Zenfor said, "and structurally sound. Even if the moons are locked in a tidal orbit, a structure between them will be subject to a lot of stress as the moons are pushed and pulled by the planet's gravity. Something like that shouldn't be able to hide, no matter how well it has been camouflaged." "I agree," Cass said, "but—" He turned back to Zenfor, working hard over the console. She was inputting parameters faster than he could see her hands move. "What? Do you have something?" "Maybe. I need to readjust your scanners to do something they shouldn't be able to do." Jan exchanged glances with Cass. He only shrugged. This was why she'd come along. Her blatant disregard for everything in the Coalition handbook was an asset, not a liability. "I'm overlaying it now," she said. The shuttle's window was covered by a light gray grid, indicating they were no longer seeing what was out there. The image flickered once. Then again. Cass squinted. He thought he could make something out, but he wasn't sure. The screen flickered a 3rd time, and he almost fell back out of his chair. The image was so jarring. There, in front of them, was a pillar 10 kilometers wide and 100 tall, coming up from the moon and extending in an arch to the other. Evie had been right. She'd been right all along. 26. Box internal log processes, time unit 2599.304.16.34.000033. Subject is resting, but awake. Internal scans reveal nothing out of the ordinary other than slightly elevated heart rate. Brainwave patterns show nothing unusual until patient attempts to sleep. Subject becomes restless and experiences what are referred to as nightmares. Personal note: Cass experienced nightmares after heavy bouts of drinking. End personal note. Further study is required. Desired result: sleep without interruption. Box interpersonal study log. Lieutenant Yamashita has come to stay by Commander Diazol's side. From what I can determine of their stilted body language and facial reactions, the lieutenant has initiated an interpersonal relationship, and the commander has either accepted or is very close to accepting. This is a most welcome development in my study of human relationship dynamics. If what I've witnessed on the net dramas plays out, they will be cheating on each other with other partners soon. I will need to monitor them closely to determine if the levels of pain and anguish I see on the net dramas bear out in real life. I am most excited, but must remember to keep my emotions at a minimum, as I do not wish to taint the project. Bach's personal note regarding matters above. Why don't more humans couple on board ships? If the net dramas are to be believed, mammals are horny most, if not all of the time. What do they do with all that excess energy, and where does it go? It will be most interesting to discover how a relationship either tempers or flares the relative horniness in each subject. I may need to take samples. To be continued. Bach stepped around the partition of the sick bay, his subject still on her bed at the other end of the room. Lieutenant Yamashita sat beside her in one of the portable chairs, her head nodding as she fought off sleep. "Commander, I'd like you to take this," Bach said, holding out a small yellow pill. The lieutenant snapped awake, blinking her eyes a few times at Bach's voice. Commander Diazol's eyes were even more bloodshot than before, and she lost some more color in her skin. Bach consulted his internal files. Neither was a good sign. "It's a sedative cocktail Zax and I crafted," he said. "We hope it will help you sleep better." The commander took the pill from him. "Is it safe?" Lieutenant Yamashita asked him. Concern for her future partner's well-being. Action noted. "Yes, we wouldn't give her anything harmful. It's supposed to speed up the REM cycle during unconsciousness. The doctor hopes pushing through the bad stuff might help you get the rest you need." Commander Diazol nodded. "Laura, can you hand me that water?" First name basis, a definite sign of future intimacy. Action noted. The lieutenant reached behind her and grabbed the small glass on the table, handing it over to the commander. Diazol placed the pill on her tongue and ingested it with the water. "I'm surprised you didn't just inject me," she said. "A direct shot into your bloodstream might have knocked you out immediately," Bach replied. "It is a strong dose. Zax thought it better you drift off." "And you're sure it can't hurt her?" Lieutenant Yamashita asked, watching the commander's face. "Curious. Subject 2 is expressing further concern, even after I have already addressed her question. Does she suspect I was lying to her? Or perhaps the question is more for her and not me. Perhaps it is to make her feel better about someone she cares about being in trouble. Eureka! I do believe I made a breakthrough. The lieutenant needs reassurance something isn't going to happen to her new partner. Their bond is already stronger than I initially suspected. Is this how fast human coupling can happen? I may need to adjust my time expectations. At this rate, they'll be dating other people within days, not weeks or seasons." "No, completely safe, Lieutenant. Your honey bunch is in no danger." The lieutenant's cheeks flushed, and the commander suppressed a smile, but turned away from him. Bach's personal note. Humans show embarrassment when confronted with the emotions they already have on display. It is odd. This never happened with Caspian and his former partners. More study is required. The commander handed the cup back to Yamashita and settled into the large pillow, leaning the bed back. "How long until it takes effect?" Bach shrugged. "A few minutes, and then you'll be off to dreamland, free to enact whatever fantasies you're currently having about the lieutenant here." The commander looked like she might choke on something. "Which, by the way, I'll need you to share with me when you wake up. For your dream journal." He turned to Yamashita, whose face was now an entirely different shade of red. Bach's interpersonal relationship study log. Hypothesis confirmed. In the event they are confronted with the emotions they are already feeling, some humans experience the added sensation of embarrassment. But it is still unclear why. Both partners are clearly aware of the other's feelings at this point. What I don't understand is why the reluctance to keep them out in the open. Shelving for further analysis. "Bach," he glanced back at the commander. "Do I need to tell you again?" "Tell me what?" he asked. This really was a conundrum. He needed to find another couple on the ship he could cross-reference his findings with. "Didn't I just say you weren't to use me as your experiment? Not more than an hour ago?" There was a definite irritation in her voice. Could it be brought on because he'd just embarrassed her? Or wait, no. It was because he had embarrassed someone she cared about. That must be it. You did, Commander. But you didn't specify I couldn't study you as a pair. Oh my God, Commander Diazol said under her breath. I'm finally starting to see what Cass is talking about. She turned to her future mate. Laura, I'm very sorry about him. Please don't be upset. No, it's fine, Laura said, forcing a smile. In Box's experience, that meant she was very uncomfortable. Perhaps his experiment had pushed things too far. He hadn't wanted to upset anyone, only confirm his theories. Box, shut down whatever research you're doing on us, and please don't continue it anymore. I'd also appreciate it if you didn't say anything about any of this, specifically anything about me and Laura, until we have given you express permission to do so. Understand? Her eyelids fluttered, and Box could tell she was having a difficult time staying conscious. But the message had come through loud and clear. I understand. I apologize if I've hurt you in any way. He turned to Yamashita. And I also apologize to you, Lieutenant. I didn't mean to harm you. The doctor is still helping me with my bedside manner. It's okay, Yamashita replied. Just caught me off guard. Your concern for the commander is touching, Box said. And I wish you only the best. He leaned in closer. But watch out for chambermaids and fancy billionaires. They are the death of relationships. Thanks, Yamashita said, giving him a funny look. He captured the image of her face for study. He'd have to cross-reference that with a few others to determine what it meant later. Commander Diazol tried and failed to suppress a yawn, closing her eyes. In turn, it caused the lieutenant to yawn. Could there be some connection between interpersonal relationships and yawning? One seemed to have caused the other. He would file it away for study in future relationships. Lieutenant, you should return to your quarters to rest. You'll need your sleep if you want to be ready for duty tomorrow, Box said. She shook her head. I'm not leaving her. You said it gets worse when she tries to sleep, right? Hopefully not with the sedative she took. But we'll find out. I'll be fine, Diazol said, though her eyes were closed, and she yawned again. The lieutenant took the commander's hand. I'll leave once I know you're okay. Box glanced up to the readings on the screen behind the bed. It seemed when Yamashita took the commander's hand, it had an effect on her physiological responses. Her heart rate slowed, and her respiratory rate dropped. Perhaps they should have brought the lieutenant in here earlier to help keep her calm. The monitor indicated Commander Diazol was falling into an unconscious state. He should notify Zax of the change in her responses when the lieutenant touched her. It might be important in a way he didn't understand yet. Box internal log processes, time unit 2599.304.16.41.415894. Subject has been administered compound 0043 in an attempt to induce REM sleep. Sedative has proven effective. Final results remain to be seen. En route to report findings to Dr. Zax. Future note: do not perform interpersonal experiments when subjects are under duress. They do not like it. Further notation: all interpersonal experiments are to be... A scream interrupted his thought processes just as he'd reached the partition into the other side of sickbay. Box turned and ran back to the source, Commander Diazol. She was thrashing on the bed, yet the lieutenant still held her hand. What happened? Yamashita asked. She was fine a second ago. There was panic in her eyes as she watched the commander flip back and forth on the bed. Box had to move around to physically restrain her from flopping herself off the bed. Commander, wake up, he yelled, but she only continued to thrash. With one hand still on her, he reached over and tapped one of the controls by the bed. It created a slight discomfort in the area around the patient's ears, which was usually enough to wake them up without any damage or risk of harm. But it was ineffective. What's going on? Why won't she wake up? The lieutenant asked. From what he could tell, she was stuck in an unconscious state, screaming at or against someone in a dream. He glanced up to the monitors. She had reached REM sleep. But now he couldn't bring her out of it. Box hit his comm. "Zach's to sickbay. Code Gray." 27. "Holy shit," Jan whispered. "Bryant, are you getting this?" "What? I can't see a thing. It looks the same to me." Cass spun in his chair. "What did you do? What are we seeing?" Zenfor wore a proud smile. It was the most satisfied he'd ever seen her. "We're seeing an area of space that has been pushed out of normal time. It exists exactly 0.03 seconds behind us." Cass turned back to the giant structure. The engineering skill required to build something like this was far beyond the capability of any Coalition world. It looked as though it had been carved from impossibly large blocks of stone, almost as if it were an ancient artifact, and not a marvel of modern engineering. Hell, maybe it was. Maybe it had been there since the dawn of time. "Pushed out of normal time?" he asked. "The intense gravity of the two stars in this system are obscuring a time shift, or perhaps creating it. At first, I thought it was just a natural adjustment we needed to make to compensate for the gravitational forces at work in the system. But either by accident or design, there is a pocket of time beside the one we can see. But because it exists slightly out of our own time stream, we can't see or interact with it. We had better hope it's a natural phenomenon. Because if a civilization has the power to create something like this, by will alone, their technology must be more advanced than anything either of our societies has ever faced before." "Well, that's reassuring," Jan said. "It isn't meant to be," Zenfor replied. "It's meant to prepare you for what's to come." Cass took a breath. At least now he could tell Evie she wasn't crazy. "How can we interact with it?" he asked. "We can't," Zenfor replied. "Not while we're in our own time stream. We'd have to shift 0.03 seconds into the past, and not even the Sill have the technology to do that." "Well, we can at least take visual scans, now that we can see it. Let's swing around and see if we can't get a good look from all sides. Take back as much data as possible." He reached over and tapped the comm. "Captain, we found the arch Evie told us about." "You found it? How?" "I'll explain when we get back. We're going to take detailed scans and then return for analysis." "Any sign of the alien fleet?" Green asked. "Nothing yet, but we'll keep an eye out." He cut the comm, turning back to Zenfor. "If you were an all-powerful alien civilization that had the technology to manipulate space-time and you wanted to hide, where would you do it?" Zenfor stared at him. "Inside a pocket just outside normal time, where no one would ever find me." "Exactly," Cass replied. "If they're still here, I'd bet anything they're hiding in that system, the one we can't reach." "Which might explain why your Starbase 5 can see them, but we can't. There might be a gravitational lens effect going on, where the farther away something is, the more blurred the lines between the two time streams become. They are already so close together. From that distance, it may be impossible to disguise." "Does that mean they've been traveling inside this pocket ever since we picked them up? Or is it just in this system? And how does it relate to the Arch? They didn't bring it with them. This thing is ancient." "I can't answer those questions without more information," Zenfor said. "I'm bringing us around," Jan said. "Prepare to get all the scans you can. Bryant, give us a little space. We can see this thing and are going to try and learn as much as possible." "Acknowledged. Yell if you need me." Ryan's space wing backed away as Jan brought the shuttle around, swinging it so the front of the shuttle continued to face the pillar they were closest to, while the ship moved around it like a corkscrew. "Data is coming in now," Zenfor said. Suddenly there was a flash, accompanied by a short burst of turbulence. "All stop," Jan said, halting the shuttle in its tracks. "What was that?" Cass glanced at Zenfor. "I have no idea. You?" She shook her head. "Wait. Something isn't right here," Jan said. "I'm not getting any readings from the rest of the shuttles anymore. Or Tempest." She tapped the comm. "Bryant? What's going on out there?" There was no response. "What the hell?" she said, peering out the window. Ryan's space wing hadn't moved. It was still hanging in space right where they left it. "Bryant, come in." There was still no response. "We need to check on him. Something's wrong." "Wait, don't move," Zenfor said. "I'm picking up something else." Cass went cold. Not more than a kilometer away was a massive black object that hadn't been there moments before. The front of it sloped down like a massive cleaving blade, and the sides swooped back to form the body of the ship. Near the rear, large assemblies on either side resembled wings in some manner, but they were unlike anything he'd seen before. And at the top of the ship, a protrusion stuck out and ended in a point. "Where the fuck did that come from?" he yelled. "I'm getting us out of here," Jan said, pointing the shuttle back the way they came. "No," Zenfor said, still hunched over her control station. "It hasn't moved or made any indication it's detected us. But it's a massive warship. I'm not going to wait around for it to decide it doesn't like what it sees." She activated the controls to send them back to Tempest. Zenfor made an aggravated noise in her throat. "This is exactly what we've been looking for. Proof of the alien fleet. We need to take detailed scans. For your people as well as mine." Jan glanced at Cass with a "what should we do" look painted across her face. He had no idea. The ship was massive and unlike anything he'd seen before. Zenfor was right. They should try and get as much information as they could, but there was no telling how long they had. Why hadn't the ship made any indication they could see them? "I think we can't let this opportunity go. She's right." "Damn," Jan muttered under her breath. "We should at least get some backup." She tapped the comm again. "Bryant, come in. Are you seeing this thing?" "He isn't receiving the transmission," Zenfor said. "I believe we're inside the time anomaly. We came through when we passed under that arch. It must be a passageway connecting the two." "So what? We're a few seconds behind him now?" Jan asked. "Yes, though I'm not sure what the situation looks like to him. We may have disappeared off his sensors, or we may still be visible, though he's having the same problem and can't contact us." "You would think if that were the case, he'd be calling for backup," she replied. Zenfor glanced up. "I'm only speculating. This is technology I'm unfamiliar with. If you'd like to attempt to interpret this data, you are welcome to it." Jan sat back in her seat, frustration painted on her face. "Look," Cass said, "let's just gather as much data as we can, and if it looks like anything is about to change, we'll just go back through the archway." "Why not go back through now and bring a bunch of the shuttles back with us? Or even Tempest?" Jan asked. "There's no guarantee the doorway stays open all the time. We may have gotten lucky to cross over when we did," Zenfor replied. "I'm performing all scans now." "Wait, does that mean we may not be able to get back across?" Jan asked. "I don't know." The Space Wing pilot shook her head. "No, we're going back now. I'm not about to be stuck on the far side of some temporal gateway, unable to return." "Catherine, wait," Cass said. "If Zenfor is right, this might be the only chance we ever get to study these aliens. That has to be worth the price of admission. If we can't get back, then it won't matter if we try right now or if we try when we're done scanning. But if we make it back over there and can't return, we'll have lost any chance we might have had." Jan sighed. "Fine. Let's just make this quick. So far, your equipment cannot penetrate their hull. But it is composed of material I've never seen before. It's a kind of mimetic alloy. It has the properties of different types of metals, but has none of them at the same time. This is very curious," Zenfor said. "Can you move the shuttle closer?" "Closer?" Jan yelled. "You've got to be kidding." Zenfor glanced up. "I don't kid." Cass nodded. "She really doesn't. I've never seen her tell a joke." Jan drew a deep breath and activated the controls. "Bringing us in closer. Caspian, perform scans using the secondary array. Visual and radiative only if you have to, but get everything you can." Cass nodded, realizing he hadn't moved at all since they'd seen the ship. He couldn't believe they'd found it. It looked nothing at all like any other ship he'd ever seen before. Even the sill ships were much more compact. But this seemed to resemble an ancient longship, like those used on the Earth of long ago. Things he'd only seen pictures of, what few pictures survived. The design was familiar, yet completely alien at the same time. He could only speculate as to its purpose. Troop transport? Science vessel? It was impossible to tell, especially since no one seemed home. The aliens wouldn't abandon it, would they? Unless it was active in a way they couldn't detect. Cass initiated all the sensors from the secondary array, gathering up info as the shuttle slowly drifted alongside the ship. "I'm still not detecting any power signatures. No heat or infrared," Xenfor said. "Do you have anything?" He didn't think he did. The side of the ship was smooth as glass, as though it had been poured from a mold instead of constructed. Out of the corner of his eye, he caught the flash of movement. "Wait!" Jan brought the shuttle to a stop. "What?" She'd activated the weapon systems. "I saw something," Cass said, scanning the side of the ship. Something on the surface moved. He glanced down at his controls and rewound the visual feed he'd been taking. "I didn't detect any changes in my readings," Xenfor said. "Here." He pointed to the image of the ship. There had been a ripple in its side as they passed, as if the surface of the ship was water reacting to the shuttle moving over it. "Go back a few meters," he said. Jan put the shuttle in reverse, back to the area on the side where he'd seen the change. "Stop here." The side of the ship rippled again. A waveform that undulated until it formed itself into what looked to be a hatch, perfectly matched to the shuttle's docking clamp at the back. "Xenfor?" "I see it," she said. "Still no power signatures, though. Is it real, or an optical illusion?" "There's only one way to find out," she replied. "We board the ship." "28. Zax came running into sickbay, not more than a minute after Box had sent the call. Laura watched as Evie thrashed back and forth, even under the suspension field Box had erected over the bed. He told Laura she had to let go of Evie's hand, despite that being the one thing she didn't want to do. In the end, he'd had to threaten doing it himself if she didn't comply, and she relented. "Give me a status," Zax yelled, yanking on her white coat with two of her forearms, while the other two fumbled with an instrument in her hand. "Unknown," Box said. "I administered the cocktail you developed, and she fell asleep. But then she started screaming, for no reason," Laura said. "She was fine one second, and the next it was like someone was killing her." She glanced down to her hand where Evie had squeezed it while she was under duress. It was red where her fingers had been. There'd been so much adrenaline surging through Laura, she hadn't even felt it. Zax stared up at the monitor. "Did you try to wake her?" "Using auditory therapy, and by trying to shake her awake," Box replied. Evie yanked one way, and the field around the bed buckled, a jolt of energy moving over the bed as she thrashed. "Re-establish the field," Zax said, running across the room and gathering a bottle from one of her cabinets. She placed the vial into the device she'd come in with, and passed it from her lower hand to her upper hand. "The power is down," Box replied. "Lieutenant, please stand back." She'd scooted closer when the field dropped. Evie was grunting now each time she thrashed. She wasn't kicking, but instead was moving back and forth like she was fighting off some invisible attacker holding her down. All Laura wanted to do was help her. Zax appeared on the other side of the bed and placed the small device under Evie's nose. Her eyes fluttered open immediately, and she screamed again, grabbing out for anything. Laura took her hand in both of hers, holding it close to her chest. "Shh, Evie, it's okay," she cooed. "No!" Evie screamed. "Get him off me!" "Commander," Box said, "there is no one on you. It is a dream." "I can see him. I can see him right now," she yelled. Her face was awash in terror, her eyes wild and unfocused. "She's having a hallucination," Laura said. "She thinks it's real." "It is real," Evie replied. "He's here. He's right here." "Who is?" Zax asked, studying the monitor again. Evie continued to thrash, but Laura held tight, determined not to let go. Though the woman was strong, Laura was getting jerked back and forth. It was surprising she had this much strength. I don't know, Evie said, calming a bit. I've never seen him before, but he won't let me go. He won't let me leave. Where are you right now, Commander? Zax asked. Laura glanced at Box, whose yellow eyes blinked at her, then returned to his patient. Laura had no idea if that meant anything or not, but she couldn't bear the thought of something happening to Evie, not now when things were finally starting to look up. I'm in a long, white room. No, it's not white. It's gray. But it's moving too. Nothing is solid here. It's just me and him. I can't see anyone else. Can you describe him? Evie thrashed again. Fuck! Why is he so strong? She yanked again, and this time the motion almost brought Laura off her feet, but still she held tight to Evie's hand. He's a dark gray with what looks like plates all over his body. He's not quite human, but I can't tell. She was struggling with her words. His head is long in the back, and he's got these eyes. They see into my soul. I don't want him looking. I can't have him. She broke off into a scream again. Get off! You have to do something for her, Laura implored. Please, this is hurting her. It's got to be neurological, Zax said, as if she were talking to herself. Box, grab me the kyanized desitrate. She turned to Evie. Commander, I'm going to give you an antipsychotic, okay? Evie only continued to thrash, while Box ran off to the other side of sickbay. Damn. She glanced at Laura. Because she's not responsive, I'm informing you I'm making a medical decision for the good of the patient. I need you to witness I attempted to reach the commander for consent. Laura nodded as Box returned with a vial. Zax inserted it into the same small device she'd held onto earlier and pressed the entire device against Evie's neck. A mild dose? Box asked. I don't want to risk anything larger, Zax said, not without knowing what we're dealing with. How long does it take? Laura asked. Evie had stilled some, but continued to fight off her invisible attacker. It shouldn't be long. It's a direct feed into her bloodstream. Her mind should start to react almost immediately. Zax turned to the feeds on the monitor. Come on. Evie grimaced and grunted, her eyes fully open, but not seeing any of them. It was like she was off somewhere else, like she could see a universe that didn't exist. Laura didn't care what it was. She just wanted it to stop. Damn, the doctor said. We're not getting any results. I'm at a loss. Whatever was affecting her sleep patterns seems to have migrated into her waking hours. It's a battle in her mind, and I don't have any way of getting inside there. It's a battle she's losing, Laura said. Look at her. I'm open to suggestions, Zax said, clearly flustered. Laura didn't think she'd ever seen the doctor upset before. In fact, she didn't think she'd ever even raised her voice. What about Commander Sester? Box said. He might have the capability to get inside her head. Maybe help her deal with whatever else is in there? Are you thinking it's more than psychological? Zax asked. I don't know, he replied, but Sester might. Zax considered it for a second, then tapped her comm. Nurse Crew 4 to sickbay. We need to prep a patient to be moved.